Let's come to Vision 3, and we're taking a look at the way in which consciousness has its own ecology. Just like nature has an ecology, there's an ecology for consciousness as well. And they fit together in a complementarity. They cinch themselves in polarity, but they free themselves in complementarity. And so one of the universal angles of vision is the right angle, 90 degrees. With the right angle, you have the way in which a horizon and a vertical can have that very special angle by which one can make a ratio of the squares of 3, 4, and 5. This is known as the Pythagorean triangle. And the horizon, when squared, plus the vertical, when squared, will equal the opposite side when squared. 4 squared is 16, and 3 squared is 9, and 5 squared is 25. Pythagoras learned this in Heliopolis in Egypt, about 500 BC. The learning there by Pythagoras preserves a very interesting relationship that ancient Egypt had, that they understood not math as we would understand it today, but they understood proportion. They understood ratios and proportion. And to them, if you could put the ratios into sound, if they were right, they would produce a harmonic. So that out of the Pythagorean tradition in the West for 2,500 years, one of the criteria in conscious form is that it is available for a harmonic analysis. And also, in the same ecology of consciousness, art forms are available to be appreciated in their beauty of their proportions, and available for, we use the French word here, a critique. Not a criticalness like Immanuel Kant's philosophy, the critical philosophy, but the French word critique is most applicable to the production of a drama, of a play. If you've ever been in a play, or you've ever been in the theater, or perhaps even directed, you know that the director, before he begins his casting even, he reads the play in the sense that he is going to perform it on the stage. And so he will make a cast so that the characters in the cast will be able to come into proportionate ratios with each other in terms of how he blocks out the play on the stage. Literally, when you begin with chalk, marking it out. At this scene, this is where the people will stand, and the movement is in this direction. They will stop here, and one will block out the play and proportion the cast, and now the play will be able to be delivered and performed. But everyone has to be tuned to the harmonic of the reality of the play. They have to understand that this is not acting, but this is playing with a high seriousness. It's not a pretense. When a play is done artistically, it is more real than physical life, more real than ritual, more real than myth, more real than the symbolic structures in the mind. It emerges with a scintillating vitality into spiritual life. And so when someone delivers the critique, after each rehearsal, the director will bring the cast together and deliver his critique or her critique. And what is she or he is doing? The director is tuning the cast to each other so that they understand that this is the way that you're relating. This is the proportion. This is the ratioing. And that all transpires on this horizon of the stage. And the stage has its ritual sequence of being blocked out, but the ritual sequence of being blocked out is indexed by the mythic language of the play. It's being fleshed out. This is what you're saying. This is how you say it. And so a director will make a critique, not willy-nilly, but to tune the cast so that they know the ritual steps of the play well enough that they will know it and can now forget about it. It's like having learned to type. You don't have to ritually think of where those letters are. You will have that inculcated. Or to learn to ride a bicycle. You don't have to remember how to balance. It's just simply there. The body ritually will take instruction and will allow for the memory, for the mind, to continue on higher functions and not have to function on the ritual level. Because when one gets to art forms, the ritual forms must give way to the art forms. Not give way in the sense that they're erased, but they drop out of the frame of reference. They drop out of the square of attention. And so, all differential conscious forms, like the person, or the play, or the symphony, or the film, or the dance, whatever it is, the ritual comportment must not be in the frame of reference, but must be there. The word that was loosely used in the 20th century was it must be unconscious. It's better to say subconscious, because it isn't really unconscious. The body will remember because the body is able to embody memory in itself. This is why when you find people being worked on their bodies, certain touches in certain places will release that memory from the body. But it's not there in the square of attention. It's not there in the frame of reference when you get to art. The last time that the ritual body's action is in the frame of reference is at the very beginnings of consciousness in its visionary phase. And so vision is very interesting as a process because it is still based on the body. It's still based on the physiology of our existence. And so all visionaries have a great respect for the body, and all yogas up through vision will always base themselves on the comportment of the action of the body. The center of the body, however, in vision, is not in the body, it's not in the mind, but it's in between them in the heart. And so the heartfulness is the feeling-toned character of oneself, not your person, not your individuality, not the action figure of what you do, but in the heartful, feeling-toned refinement of your character in its mythic horizon. So that in ancient Egypt, when you died, the first visionary thing that was set up as a purpose, as a goal, as something to get to, was the weighing of the heart. It was called the psychostasia in Greek. It's in the 125th chapter of the Egyptian Book of the Dead. We'll come back to the Egyptian Book of the Dead in just a moment. The heart was placed in its little jar, and it was weighed against a feather, which was the feather that Ma'at carries. Ma'at is the Egyptian goddess who embodies justice, order. In ancient Avestic, about 4,000 years ago, in Zarathustran visionary language, her name was Asha. She is the order of the universe. She is the order of the universe in terms of the heartfulness of one's living experience. And her complement, Ma'at's complement, is Thoth, the god who creates writing. He creates symbolic language that can be written in tandem with Ma'at's living language of the heart. And so the mind's accuracy in its order is deeply based upon the order of the heart of the character. And so the very first thing that one will aim at is to make sure that your heart is pure, because only a pure heart will be as light as the feather of Ma'at, of just order. Her just order is that of the heartful feeling. Thoth is keeping track that your heart is as pure as her feather of justice and order, so that he can inscribe the results of that weighing. And the inscription of the results of that weighing now is your passport to eternity that has been verified. Now you are ready to travel in a very special way. You're able to travel through the netherworld, through death, and come back into life again, to be reborn. The relationship of Thoth to Ma'at is extraordinarily ancient and goes back, as we have been saying, tens of thousands of years. The quality is one that is elusive, and for the last 400 years in the West, it has been unappreciated and trashed and beggared on many levels. And yet it's always been there, because the transform that happens is that the forms of art and of science must come out of the ecology of consciousness. They do not occur in the ecology of nature. The forms of consciousness are supernatural in that way. Supernatural not in the sense that they're fictive, but supernatural in the sense that they are above and beyond nature, though based on them and in a complementarity with them. So that consciousness bears the same relationship to nature that thought bears to feeling. Just as the written symbols of thought are a deep emergence from the heartful character of mythic experience, art forms come out of visionary consciousness in a complementary way. Whereas the mind must come out and be ordered to be integral, the artistic person, the art of person making, beautiful woman named Virginia Satir, who did a lot of great sociological work a number of decades ago, had a book called People Making. The art of learning is the art of making your person. But the person does not come out as an integral form. It doesn't come out in the mind. It comes out as a differential form, which means it comes out as an array of possibilities. And its order are that the possibilities that one chooses to explore, if they are real, they will, all the possibilities, all the details of all the possibilities that you have chosen will be resonances that can be put together in a spectrum that will have a harmonic. So that one knows that is consciously real by the harmonic of the resonances, and not transferring it to the mind, where the mind needs to have it in symbolic patterns that are stable and centered and ordered. So a great deal of the difficulty of becoming a conscious human being is that we are trying to stuff the wind into a Coke bottle. You get some interesting sounds at the right angle, but that's not what it's for. And so trying to put the spirit in mental forms is a fool's gold. It's irrelevant. It has no place whatsoever. This was the ancient wisdom of men and women for tens of thousands of years. Now, when we look at the iconography of Thoth, we see that it is a man with a bird's head, an ibis. The first time that that man with a bird's head shows up is 20,000 years ago in Lascaux. And in Lascaux, there is, as we have been talking about, a man with a bird's head who also has a bird's head on a staff. And this is in the bottom back wall of the pit of the shaft, as they prefer to call it in modern paleontology. And that Lascaux was a Paleolithic temple. It was 20,000 years ago the registry of the beginnings of the first civilization that ever appeared on this planet. Before that, there were cultures. There were tribal cultures, but there was no civilization. The very first culture to make it into a civilization, it is called in paleontology the Magdalenian, named for La Madeleine, which was the region in France, on the southern Dordogne, Vizier Valley area. And peculiarly, it also reflects the name of Mary Magdalene, which is one of the most hermetically paradoxical occurrences in the world, that the very first human civilization on the planet should be named for, literally, Mary Magdalene. When I put together all of my notes and translations and emendations to the entire Hermetica, I put two illustrations on the cover. One of them is from the Egyptian Book of the Dead about rebirth, and down below is the little patch that contains the three Marys. The three Marys occur on one of the earliest Christian churches in the world. It was made in the 240s AD in what is today Iraq. In a place in Iraq, we call it by the modern archaeological name of Dura Europos. And Dura Europos is on the Euphrates River, and it is the first place going north on the Euphrates River that you can run a caravan route across the desert and reach the Mediterranean Sea. Below that, the desert is too formidable, but there at where Dura Europos was, you can go for the first time across the desert, and the first oasis community you come to is Palmyra, and then you come into the Bekaa Valley, which eventually contains Damascus and other places. And in this way, the Tigris-Euphrates civilizations were able to contact the early Near East on the edge of the Mediterranean Sea, where the Phoenicians lived, where Canaan was, where the ancient Jewish population finally settled, and was for a long time always an outlying province of Egypt. And so ancient Sumeria and ancient Egypt, the civilization of the Nile and the civilization of the Euphrates, had a contact on this caravan route. The first persons to run that caravan route ran it a little bit to the north. To the north of it is a city of the moon god named Haran. And in Haran, a man named Terah ran the longest caravan routes in the ancient Near East at that time. This is about 1900 BC, 2000 BC. And his business was very lucrative because he had caravan routes that went into the Iranian plateau, where there was one of the rare sources of tin. And he would bring the tin on caravan routes. The beast of burden was the black donkey. Horses were not yet available. Camels were not yet used. And on those black donkeys, he would bring the tin, and all along the way would pay off the various customs with little bits of the tin, and also take it all the way up to the great copper mines that were there in Anatolia, where if you put tin and copper together, you make for the very first time bronze. And the appearance of bronze civilization owes its economic viability to Terah and his caravans. But Terah was very smart. He thought, since we have Iran and we have Sumeria Akkad and we have Anatolia, why don't we include Egypt? And so he sent one of his sons to make contact with Egypt, and that son's name was Abraham. And that's how the Semitic people, for the first time, got into contact with Egypt on a caravan trade route. And in order to ensure that the caravan trade route was secure, they needed to have two things that were indispensable. They needed to have wells that they could use, so that they would own these wells, so you could get water for your beasts and for your people. And you had to have burial places. You had to have cemeteries in which to inter honorably anyone who died. And so the first Jewish settlements in what is today the Palestinian-Israeli area were the wells, and there were two. There was one in Samaria underneath a mountain called Gerizim. It's the well that is famous in the New Testament where Jesus talked about the woman and her adultery and said, whoever is without blemish, this blemish, you may cast the first stone at her, to stone her to death. And no one could cast a stone. And she was let go in the New Testament. He said, I find no fault in you either. You're a human being, and you're living a human life, and you didn't realize you were not able to sustain the covenant of your marriage, but this is why the world needs to have a retuning. And the second well was Rachel's well, named for Abraham's wife, that was outside of a crossroads that today is where Bethlehem is. And so Mount Gerizim was the origin of a particular kind of stringency in the Jewish tradition, and it is exemplified by the prophet Samuel. So that the prophet who made the kingship come to the Jewish tradition was Samuel from the Mount Gerizim area. Samuel was dedicated to the service of God while he was still in his mother's womb. And so he was literally dedicated before he was born to the service of God. And in the ancient Semitic language, such a person then was a Nazarite. And so the dedication of Jesus to the service of God before he is born doesn't refer to his geographical place, Nazareth, but to his spiritual dedication, a Nazarite. As you can see, the world is ignorant of even the most basic, deep pivots of truthfulness. The weighing of the soul, the weighing of the psychostasia, with Thoth, with the ibis head, and the fact that 20,000 years ago one finds all of this there, all of this at Lascaux, and that it's the founding of the Magdalenian civilization, and that I would put the three Marys, it's Mary Magdalene, it's Mary, the mother of Jesus, and is Mary, the mother of John, Mark, and three other children. She is identified always in the Gospel according to Mark as the mother of James the Less and the mother of Josie and of Salome. And Mark well knew this because that was his own mother. And it is Mary, the mother of Saint Mark and of these other three children, who owned the house in which the Last Supper took place on the second floor. And she was extremely close to Mary Magdalene. Mary Magdalene, by the way, was not a prostitute at all. She was the most learned woman of her day. She is the one who went to the cave of the interment of the crucified Jesus. And she is the one who brings the resurrection news out. And her companion there was Mary, the mother of John Mark. John, at the time, And you'll find in the Gospel of John the accurate eyewitness report of this, because St. John at the time was only about 11, 12 years old. And when Mary Magdalene brought the news of the missing body of Jesus, that she had seen an angel in a vision tell her that he has risen. He is not here in the sepulcher. He got up and walked out. He's not dead. He's resurrected. He's reborn. The young St. John was faster than St. Peter, who was kind of a burly fisherman character and couldn't run all that fast. And young St. John was the first one after the two Marys to see the situation, and his reporting of it in the Gospel of John is a first-hand report. He was there. But he was there in a very special way because he had been given in adoption to Mary Magdalene. On the cross, when Jesus was dying, he said, "Behold, this is your mother." Now, Mary Magdalene at the time was about 44 years old. It is not that the young St. John to be was given to Jesus' mother because she was already an old woman. She was born in 23 BC. She died in 41 AD. At 64, she was 59 years old. The crucifixion took place in 37 AD. But Mary Magdalene took care not only of the young St. John, but took care of Mary, the mother of Jesus. And she took those two under her wing and took them to the city in Asia Minor called Ephesus. And it's there that Mary, the mother of Jesus, was buried. It's there that St. John is buried. It's there that Mary Magdalene was buried as well. And we'll talk more about it as we go on into vision. What is important is that where Mary Magdalene was buried, and I will bring a photograph of her tomb, of her crypt. It's massive, it's still there. It was at the beginning of a cave which became known later on in Christian and Islamic history as the Cave of the Seven Sleepers. And it was this Cave of the Seven Sleepers that carries the tone all the way back from the Paleolithic caves. And one recognizes in a direct line that these caves, these catacombs where people are buried, which were also the places where the congregation came together to worship, so that the earliest churches and the caves of burial were together. And even today, all major monasteries, all major churches have a crypt underneath where the sacred, the holy are buried, because one keeps this as holy ground. All this goes back not only to the Paleolithic caves like Lascaux, but directly in the way are the pyramids, are the Egyptian burial tombs, the mastabas, the caves in the Valley of the Kings. So that death always was a part of the holy cycle of the Spirit and not something bad. It was a part of the way in which nature has its cycle of renewal, and its cycle of renewal included a dimension of consciousness that allowed for life not only to participate in cycles of birth and life and death, but of adding a fourth stage to it of rebirth. So that rebirth was like a parallel to life. And if one could be reborn, in the Egyptian mode, it was one day at a time, every day at the rising of the sun. The final refinement was in the time of Hermes Trismegistus, the time of Jesus, where it was recognized that if one did it in a very special, complete way, the rebirth was eternal. One didn't come back one day at a time, or even one life at a time, but one came into eternal life so that one would never, ever die again. So the Hermetic tradition goes back all the way back to the Magdalenian civilization, at least, at Lascaux. And when one looks at the iconography of the bird-headed man and the bird-headed staff, which later in Egypt became a scepter, it became known as the was scepter. And it would have a symbolic bird's head, the ibis head, and it would have its long staff, and it would have the curl at the end, which was like the feet of a bird ready to gain its perch. And later on, it became just iconographically like the place in which you would put that on a horizontal rod, and you would be able to make that right angle and that particular relationship, that ratio, where one would have the foundations of universal geometry and proportion, which when carried into a conscious dimension would give you the key to resonances grouped so that they would make a harmonic. It's an important thing to realize and to understand that all of this tradition went on for tens of thousands of years. It's not like it was made up at some time in history, but was there before history was able to occur. Because history is a higher registry of visionary consciousness. And in order for history as a process to come into registry, it has to have a traction and a base of people who have come together in a civilization. A vision can come to one person and be shared with others. But a civilization that produces history is only from the population of many, 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 many people together. And so history as a process is vision raised so that it isn't just the array of possibility for someone to emerge through choice and critique, but for everyone to emerge and to come into a very special kind of a form, which is called the cosmos. And so civilization as a process and not a thing. It is the process of history, and it reveals the cosmos as an objective form, not an integral form, but as a differential form. In this way, for the cosmos to come into play, just like when art comes into play, ritual has to go out of the frame of reference. When the cosmos comes into play, the mind has to go out of the frame of reference. Not to erase it, but to not be in the composition. And so the Zen saying is that when pure consciousness achieves the cosmos, one then, as a person, has no mind. Let's take a break. Let's come right back. The Three Marys fresco survived because it was on the wall of a Christian church, and it was destroyed in 256 AD. Not the church, but the whole city was sacked. And fortunately, the back wall of the Christian church was abutting one of the city walls. And so when everything was put into ruins, the ruins covered this wall of frescoes. And they were not discovered until almost the middle of the 20th century. the expedition was mounted by Yale University. And Yale published about a couple of dozen volumes on the archaeology of Dura Europos. What was interesting is that Christian church in Dura Europos was right next to a Jewish synagogue. And so the back wall of the Jewish synagogue was also preserved. And when historians of Christianity and Judaism look at that synagogue and that Christian church, they're a little embarrassed because the iconography is very close and has nothing to do with the supposed iconography of Christianity and Judaism. The Jewish synagogue has an Orpheus theme. The Christian church has the theme of the three Marys as equal resonances in a harmonic that witness the resurrection, because right next to the three Marys is on that wall the crypt where the crucified Jesus was buried, and above it on the corners are three stars, but they're not stars, they're like lines drawn. They're like flash points, and one finds those flash points consistently also in Hellenistic Jewish lore, but what is more important, one finds it in Paleolithic art as well. There was a Frenchman named André Leroy-Gourhan and his wife, Arlette. Arlette did the great article for Scientific American a number of years ago on the archaeology of Lascaux. Her husband was puzzled by a lot of extraneous marks in Paleolithic caves, and so he made a catalog of all of them from all the caves and put them into a harmonic. And he found that again and again, when you bring them together in a kind of a focus, they make what I used to call the Paleolithic star. And it's that Paleolithic star that occurs in synagogues over the head of Moses and in Christian churches over the head of Jesus. It's the guiding star. It is the spirit of the cosmic response to the spiritual person that presences itself above whoever it is. And that presence is made, it's established in the iconography east and west of that kind of like a thought bubble, that kind of a clear nimbus. Not the halo, but the clear space. You'll see it in Buddhist art, and all Christian saints have it. Everywhere in the world one has it. It is a space of clarity that surrounds the head. That space of clarity in the ancient wisdom was always the openness of the sky. And that openness of the sky during the day is filled with sunlight, and at night it's filled with stars. And I'll bring next week one of the great early tarot decks from the Italian Renaissance, painted by one of the greatest of all the Italian Renaissance painters, Andrea Mantegna, and show you those spheres of clarity and those spheres of stars are there in that tarot deck from 1465 in Milan, in Italia. In Lascaux, one doesn't find the signature of the name of an artist, but one finds the icon of the artist. And the icon of the artist who masterminded Lascaux, who painted the cave. His icon is the head of a black horse, a stallion, with a Paleolithic fuzzy mane because they were just coming out of the period of the Ice Age, and horses had very fluffy, furry manes. This black stallion head occurs specifically as a punctuation in several places in the Lascaux cave, 3 of which are the triangle of the composition of the whole Paleolithic temple. The first time the head occurs, it is the first image as one comes into the cave. As one would come into the Paleolithic entrance to Lascaux 20,000 years ago, the first thing that is there is the black horse's head. And then it occurs in a direct line at the end of that long series of passages. And at the end of that long series of passages with many Paleolithic images in between is another black horse's head. Only this black horse's head is on an outcropping that comes down, not a stalactite, but an outcropping that comes down as if it were like a descending stela, and there's the black horse's head again, but there's an upside down horse underneath it. And that's the end of that concourse. And one then would come back from that iconography, and along the wall one finds a punctuation where there are a tribe of little black horses underneath some of the larger bison and aurochs, the big bulls and so forth. And punctuating them are 3 horses that are of a special delicate quality of color. They're called the Chinese horses. The French are very romantic. And they're like the feminine version of the black stallion. But as one comes back along, there is a major offshoot of this central corridor, and this major second corridor goes off at a right angle to the first long corridor, the main corridor. And as one goes off to the other angle, there is an indentation in the cave, and it's actually called the apse. It's just like a cathedral. Apse. You have the main nave, and then you have these kinds of cutout areas in the architecture, the apse, where there is then a special shrine in that apse. And at this single apse in Lascaux is where the back of the apse is the shaft, the pit. Now the straight fall in that pit is 26 feet, but it quickly slopes down. And it's about 40-some feet altogether. And there at the bottom of that shaft, the back of that apse, is where you find the bird-headed man, splayed, because he is in free fall, peril of death. And you find next to him is a very large bull, which is looking back over its shoulder at a rupture in its belly, and all of its guts are coming out. And on the other side of the splayed man is a rhinoceros going away. And in the middle of this composition of those 3 is the staff with the bird's head. Thoth has that bird's head. Across the shaft from the rhinoceros, the splayed man, the bird's head, scepter, staff, and the bull is another black horse's head. So when you triangulate the 3 of them together, they say to the composition that this cave is a mystery initiation of surviving the terror of death in a sudden, irrevocable, convincing moment that you have no chance whatsoever, and then you are saved. Now, the reason for the falling horse at the back is that area where Lascaux is, in that part of France, there are cliffs that come down and feed into this valley where this river is, where the caves are. And Paleolithic hunters usually were not able to just go and hunt something and bring it down. They preferred to drive the animals over a cliff so that they would fall and fall to their death. And then they could be butchered right away, and one could literally, the phrase was, make meat for a long time. Preserve it, pounding various berries in, so the sugars or the herbs, and one can actually make a beef jerky that you can live a long time on. Saves. The reason why this is understood by me is that the Blackfoot Nation in Montana and Alberta, which I am related to by adoption and family, that's how they made their meat. And the Blackfoot would drive the buffalo over the cliffs in a part of southern Alberta that was a major part of the reservation. And the Blackfoot Nation was so efficient at hunting in this way that they would finish making their meat for the year before midsummer. And so young Blackfoot men would have the leisure of the whole second half of the summer, and they would traditionally go traveling because they had also were one of the first tribes to incorporate the horse into their culture. And they would ride as far away as the Navajo lands in New Mexico just to go visiting, because they had done all their work for the year of making meat and of making the skins for the tents and the clothes and everything. So they had a vacation every year from the same technique. The driving of the game over the cliff so that they would fall to their death is complemented by the man falling over into the shaft, being literally pushed into the shaft to his death. But that bungee cord of the 3 thongs woven together, fragments of which were found in the bottom of the shaft, it saved him at the last second. And then the little oil lamps that have been found there with the animal fat in one scooped out portion and then the hand-held other portion, these would be lit again, and one would then realize that you had participated in this grand ingress to the proliferation of life, of the game, which was the basis of life, and also the basis of an afterlife, because one now is conscious of it. At the entrance, after the signature of Black Stallion, who painted Lascaux, was the architect, artist for the whole thing. It was all done within one lifetime, 20,000 years ago. The first animal after that is the only non-realistic animal in Lascaux. It's the only non-realistic animal almost anywhere in Paleolithic art, but it is realistic to a supernatural level. It can't be identified right away, except that when you look at it, you realize that it is pregnant. It has a huge swayed belly, it's pregnant, but it has spots as if it were like some kind of an animal. It has a face like it's a different kind of animal. It has horns that are so long that they're supernatural, they're surreal. And so this animal is called the unicorn. The French are very romantic, as I said. But the unicorn is not a unicorn of one horn, it has two horns. And the two horns are like a tuning fork of the possibilities beyond nature that starts the entire concourse of the cave temple of Lascaux. Because right away following the unicorn is the first great mass of bulls and bison and aurochs and horses, and you get the pell-mell of the flow, the cascade of the animals of the natural world upon which life was based, and upon which revealed a mystery disclosure that there is a supernatural life behind all life, behind its complete cycle, and that one has to be initiated into this. That kind of pictograph, hieroglyphic, is the basis of all languages on this planet or any planet. It's always a ritual sequence of images, of pictures that increasingly are selected out to be correlate and then symbolically indexed and shortened and revised and abstracted and finally become the alphabets of the world. This is the way a written language is made. This is the purview of a shaman or of a Thoth, of a Hermes Trismegistus. The same ancient technique was used in the 300s AD, when under penalty of death from the Roman Empire, now become the Roman Empire using Roman Christianity as its authority to bring people into the authority of its control. Anyone who practiced the ancient ways was killed. That's why material like the Dead Sea Scrolls were buried. That's why material like the Nag Hammadi material were buried. But always there was another way of burying it, and that is to put it into symbols without language, without text. And that's how things like the tarot cards were first made. And the first images that were made in that way in the late 300s AD have this quality of being mysterious, terse images that if you do not know the initiatory ritual cycle and have the symbolic key for it and how to use it consciously in an artistic way, there's no way that anyone would be able to understand that and unlock it. Tarot cards were made in the Renaissance because they rediscovered the Hermetic tradition and began to understand this is how all of this works, how it is all put together. Next week I'll come with a diagram of how the tarot cards, when put on a standard Christian cathedral floor plan, play out exactly and show the whole initiation cycle that the Hermetic tradition has had for at least 20,000 years. We're following both the Hermetic tradition in the West and the Taoist tradition in the East, and those are the two traditions that made alchemy. That one can not only have a rebirth by transforming oneself out of a natural form that dies naturally into a supernatural form that does not ever die, and to be able to then project that back onto the world of existence and change the forms of things that are. And that's how alchemy began. And the first alchemy is the making of metals, followed by a second wave of alchemy, which is the making of the minerals. One makes the metals that were never there in nature. Bronze doesn't occur in nature. Tempered iron doesn't occur in nature. Steel doesn't occur in nature. All of these are alchemical metals. And the same for minerals. There are proportions, and now minerals are not just minerals, they are medicines. And so alchemy makes not only lead into gold, but it makes the elixir of life, so that one doesn't return just to health and live a healthy life, one returns to eternal life with the right alchemy. So that medicines and metallurgy and art and architecture, all of these are qualities that belong together. They belong in the ecology of consciousness, and without vision, one will never know. You cannot guess it. And certainly, as one looks at the tens of millions of books written, especially in the last 400 years of printing presses, you find almost no one understanding it all. It is a savage wasteland indeed. When we began the first year, we said, we are shifting our learning away from subjects to phases. Because when we put our learning into a phase form, we get a different experience, a different readout that was never compromised by the flaws of the past. They didn't have access to it at all. And the few individuals or the few small esoteric groups that would from time to time rediscover it, recover it, did very well with it. What's necessary now is for the planet, on scale of billions of people, to do well with it. And so our learning is being put into a phase form, and the phases have a syncopation. They have an alternation. We have a phase of process, and then we have a phase of form, and another phase of process that comes out of that, and another phase of form. But there are two kinds, two modes of process and of form. There are integrals and there are differentials. One is based on centering stability, which uses polarity as its structure and its order. The mind must polarize in order to think symbolically. But the person cannot do that. If you try to stabilize a differential form like an artistic person, you're going to ruin it. You're going to ruin the beauty. You're going to ruin the art. Because it's based on an array of possibility that is open and not on a closed stability that is centered and tight. One of the qualities that makes this, I'm going to use Experience in Nature by John Dewey, published first in 1925. It's just a paragraph from a chapter in this called Existence as Precarious and as Stable. Quarrels among conflicting types of philosophy are family quarrels. They go on within the limits of a much too domestic circle and can be settled only by venturing farther afield out of doors. Concerned with imputing complete, finished, and sure character to the world of real existence, even if things have to be broken into two disconnected pieces, in order to accomplish the result, the character desiderated can plausibly be found in reason or in mechanism, in rational conceptions, in brute things like sensory data, but not in consciousness. And then he goes on, and later on he will say, a world that was wholly risky would be a world in which adventures are impossible, and only a living world can include death. Such facts have been celebrated by thinkers like Heraclitus and Lao Tzu. And the reason he wrote Experience in Nature is that he had just come back from China. He went as a distinguished lecturer to Japan, and then he went to China and was in China for a year, lecturing everywhere. And before the influence of Marx on 20th century China, John Dewey's pragmatism was the #1 influence on the whole country, and it is again. The pragmatic and Experience in Nature was so profound for Dewey when he came back that he wrote a book on art called Art as Experience by 1934. And later on came to write the Phi Delta Pi lecture towards the end of his life. He lived into his 90s, and he was over 90, Experience in Education. Because he and his wife, Evelyn, had, as early as 1900 in Chicago, developed experimental schools, and they wrote a book together called Schools of Tomorrow, a collection of Dewey's work on experience, nature, and freedom. The Taoist quality of Dewey's philosophy and work is best shown by a poem. He also was a poet. A whole volume of his poems is published by Southern Illinois University Press. This is in a book by Stephen C. Rockefeller on John Dewey. Stephen Rockefeller is a nephew of Lawrence Rockefeller and David and Nelson. Then rose the swelling moon and gently sought its magic way across the waters. In a tune of silvered silence merged the day with night, earth with sky, the world and me. Through the moonlight's softly shining gray merged rigid land and fluent sea. By the magic of inaction, beguiled, life and death slept close, reconciled. And so you get the Taoist and the Hermetic traditions together in America's greatest philosopher, John Dewey. One of the qualities of using Thoreau at the beginning of the first year and pairing him with the I Ching is it gave us a way to go into nature at the origins of Chinese civilization with the I Ching, and at the poignant penetration back into Paleolithic nature with Thoreau. When Thoreau was born in the early 1800s, and where he was born, the little town of Concord, Massachusetts, as a boy, he and his brother John used to collect Indian artifacts all the time. And Thoreau became famous as a boy. He could always find the Indian artifacts, the arrowheads, the different things, and he had a huge collection. And so one of the things that he did as an older boy and as a young man, he read everything he could on the American Indians, and he took notes, and they amounted to 11 volumes. The Indian Notebooks of Thoreau. It was bought by the Pierpont Morgan Library, where it is in New York City. And last year we were able to get copies, rare Xerox copies of all of Thoreau's Indian notebooks. They've never been published. They are not just notebooks. They are the visionary background against which the cycle of consciousness is not just a journey, but becomes a quest. And The American Indian was still in the Paleolithic mode. Their vision quests were to go and immerse one into nature, out of culture into nature, so that one would have a direct link to a vision. It's called, in all Indian languages, it translates as crying for a vision. Crying for a vision. And the first movement in crying for a vision is sending a voice. This is the ancient Hermetic Paleolithic, ancient Taoist Paleolithic mode. One sends a voice out into the supernatural realm within which the world has its shape, deeper and older than the world, so that the voice is not one to be heard by an ear, but to be heard completely by the unseen. And in that vision quest, he built Walden as a cabin in order to be his tent, not just on the edge of civilization, but on the edge of the primordial nature of the cosmos, where he could hear. First of all, when one sends a voice in a vision, one learns to hear silence. One learns to hear that nothing of man is being said now. Nothing of the world is heard now. And in that silence, one is able to hear the supernatural language. In the Hermetic treatise, the eighth reveals the ninth. It is when all of the resonances of the eight are brought together into their octave. One goes into the silence of the ninth, and in the silence of the ninth, one hears God's singing. And it's that perfect 10th dimension of God's singing that teaches one then the new calibration of rhythm. The rhythm of eternal life, not the rhythm of just natural life. But eternal life is not antithetical to natural life. It just introduces the rainbow array of possibilities, so that life now, even in the natural world, has all the variants of freedom. And this is how civilizations are made. We're going to come back next week and talk about Taoist alchemy and Hermetic alchemy, and how the change of form requires this putting oneself into a visionary mode, going to cry for a vision. When Shakespeare was near the end of his life, when he was writing The Tempest, one of the most esoteric Hermetic books was published in Germany. His name, the author's name was Heinrich Kunrath, and the title of the book in Latin translates as the Amphitheater of Wisdom, Amphitheatricum Sapientiae. And the frontispiece in there had an alchemist's laboratory. And in the laboratory, there were three elements. One of the elements was where you did the metal work, the metallurgy. Another was a tent where you prayed, where you offered yourself. The deepest prayer is not to pray in asking for something, but in giving all of yourself to the openness. The ancient way to do that was the arens, the raising of the arms. And one finds this again and again in the ancient Egyptian wisdom. This is the way that one approaches the transform, because only by offering not only everything one is, but offering everything one could be, that the reciprocal the complementarity comes that you are given everything in complete freedom. This is wisdom as opposed to instruction. This is learning as opposed to rote. And what we are doing here is pioneering in bringing back that ancient wisdom concourse where journeys and quests both together can occur in the same lifetime, in the same character, in the same person. And one relates one side to nature, on the other side to the cosmos, to the sun and to the stars. The way in which that was presented in ancient Egypt was always that Shu and Tefnut, the sky and the earth, were seen as two lions, a lion and a lioness, back to back. And the royal throne, the lion throne, was where the king sat on the backs of the horizon of those two lions. And in the Egyptian Book of the Dead, the deceased is laid on a lion bed, a bed in the shape of a lion. It is on the place of that lion, and it's a famous phrase, the place of the lion. It is on that horizon that one is able then to be positioned in a pivotal place between the sun rising and the sun setting, between east and west, between birth and rebirth. But note, the birth is in the east, but the rebirth is in the west. It is the Western paradise that has the entrance to the rebirth quest. It is the Eastern sunrise that has the key to the birth journey. These are held in complete equanimity when the mind is completely open, without a thought, without a sound, without an image. And in that complete openness, the horizon of experience receives something, hopefully not just a sneeze. More next week.